Okay, I'm speaking quite differently to the way that I've approached these questions so far. I've been trying to find a different or better term than worker here. I've been going through author or creator or whatever the term might be, but I've gone for work and worker, talking a bit about the reorientation of those ideas. So before I get into that, that's not good. I'm going to talk a bit about the work and the notion of a work. One of the things that hypertext scholars, particularly in the early stages, talked about a lot was the power of the published object or the published artifact. So there is this kind of emphasis on the significance of the kind of independent artifact. Johnson Mayo talked about the physical stability of the book, which renders them as machines for rendering authority. That there's this idea of the kind of stability and stable item, the handing of that object over. Going through to Bartlett, I talk about going in these kind of lectures. The work is a fragment of substance occupying part of the space of books, whereas the text is a methodological field. So the work is a thing, it's a physical, instantiated object. Then later on in variants, talking specifically about books as artifacts. Evick says that books, though inert documents in themselves, determine how texts are physically presented, what their extensive limitations are. Books influence how texts are read. So there's those kinds of ways of talking about the work, and Airseth describing the boundaries between literary works as cultural constructs and the product purely of print media culture. That the only reason we think of books as these kind of bounded linear objects is because of the necessity of print publication, which obviously we're by books now. So that's one way of thinking about the work as a kind of limitation on the potential explosion of ideas and so on. The other way is to say that people who write books like to get enough money to eat food and have a house and have a life and therefore continue to exist through the work that they create. So books are one way of guaranteeing a kind of flow of capital and a flow of value. So now I'm talking in 1997 hypertext is that each author produces something unique and identifiable as property. This is particularly in the case of literary print culture. Then later on, Mara and Squire saying that the publishing value chain has remained relatively consistent since the invention of the printing press. The opportunities to extract from those economic value, social value, and so on through that process of publication, and now obviously we're entering into a situation in which that value chain is being increasingly disrupted and disintermediated, that we're removing the opportunity for people to extract value through their transmission of physical artifacts. One of the things I remember that Nelson talked about was the problem of copyright on the internet. How do you guarantee that this will be only copy, or at least that there's some way of guaranteeing ownership? So whatever the disadvantages of the linear print work, it does have the advantage of at least being an object to be traded, the value being placed on the work. And there's obviously an academic context for that as well. You know, we tend to think of text and context, we tend to think of the object, the transmission object for information or meaning, and then the circulating context around it. Often we'll refer to that when we talk about intentionalism, for example, or we talk about new historicism. We're talking about the object as being the centre of study, and then the context circulating around that, the author's biography, for example, or the other information related to that historically. So hopefully I'll be able to transition the slides from here, or I might have to... there we go. So there's this idea of orientation around the work, and obviously that's validated from lots of different perspectives, with the emphasis on the text and context and the circulating elements around it. Releasing one-off works, however, require the maintenance of complex networks of engaged and motivated individuals. It's the reason that publishing companies still exist in the form that they do, is they have the connections, the marketing clout, the kind of long tail to be able to market and sustain a work which often takes months, if not years, to produce. So the small press structure that you often find in games and the creation of games through things like Twine, for example, that kind of work is very labour intensive. It requires a very close, well-maintained, well-grouped community who are able to access those works in order to sustain them. People are often marginalised in the first place. There's a reason that those big publishers exist, as I said before. So, as Alan puts it, talking about the rise of Twine as a platform, as long as there's some sort of infrastructure, valuable works, those by both dabbling amateurs and dedicated artists, can reach the audience. There needs to be the infrastructure to support the distribution of those works that goes beyond it. One of the things I think is so interesting is that Twine works tend to be self-contained. They're a kind of unit with a network inside it, which then gets distributed on a separate network. You don't tend to integrate them into those wider networks beyond that case. So, what this does mean is that often the creators of these works are required to integrate with these wider networks and maintain those networks as well, which obviously has a knock-on effect on them. one of the things that I'm interested in is people like Ian Roach was talking about the quality that Twine has, and one of the things he emphasises is the use of Twine for creating what we call vignettes, the idea of creating a kind of emotional state or an emotional moment through that independent work. I'm talking about Twine specifically just for kind of comparative units. So you can think about that work as kind of expressing a moment or expressing an emotional state, but often those creators are interesting because of what they're saying through those works and our desire to connect to them as well. It's the reason that I've included down at the bottom there this quote about social penetration theory, although we can talk about parasocial relationships in those terms if we want to. The idea that in the process of social engagement, when we meet someone for the first time, you tend to broaden out your knowledge of that person by expanding the areas you discuss, but also deepening that each conversation creates a deeper and closer relationship between you and the person that you're communicating with. So if we borrow some of the language that we find in transmedia, which I feel like is one of those hugely important but slightly neglected areas as we kind of run out of things to talk about with it, Colin Hardy says that the digital affords opportunities to all those implicated in transmedia networks while simultaneously imposing limitations. The limitation, I think, is that there's a requirement for you to put as much energy into the maintenance of relationships and communities as there is the creation of the works themselves. You can no longer be this sort of kind of aloof figure. In fact, you have to be far more of a presence in these networks in order to support and sustain the works that you're creating. So if we think about transmedia, as Elizabeth Evans puts it, as a collection of different segments of content brought together in a whole larger than the individual segments, what we're talking about is the individual author's creative work, but also the work of themselves as being of equivalent and equal interest. You want to find that you have figures who create these individual works and spend a lot of time supporting them. So one of the things that I'm tracking from that point is that if we say that transmedia is this practice of meaning production and interpretation, sharing this content and material, what's the logical conclusion for that? Well, the conclusion is that what most audiences are actually seeking is a close communicative relationship with the creator. They want to start off and build an understanding of that person and drill down into who they are, why they think the way that they do, and to really build that relationship. So if we're thinking parasocially or in terms of social penetration, you have this initial opportunity to discover that somebody is interesting. And we're all having that moment now. You see somebody, they say something up here, and you go, oh, that's interesting. And you think, I'd like to know that person better, I'd like to get to know who they are. So there's this initial kind of connection point, which tends to be the work. This is why I've chosen Brian Limmer, who's a Scottish comedian who had a BBC TV series. He decided to get his TV series commissioned. He wanted it to do on a very low cost. It's great, 2 seasons, very, very funny. But he's then switched over to Twitch and now has this enormous audience of Twitch followers who follow him, making jokes, doing skits, making kind of comments and commentary. He streams on Twitch for about 3 hours every day, and every now and again he'll release a small book or a pamphlet or a poem or a short video or something else. And because he's sustained and maintained this community, these are almost seen as kind of indulgent hobbies, that his fans are actually there for the relationship they have with him, and the work tends to be something which he feels is particularly important, but which others can kind of take it or leave it. When you look at things like Patreon, for example, and the expansion of those relationships that it creates, and the social media networks that are created as well, is there going to be this inversion, where instead of us starting from the work and only thinking about the context and the author in terms of what it tells us about the work itself, what if there's a reorientation, and instead we just see the work as circulating around the worker, the person at the centre? And what's the consequence of that? Is it positive in the sense that people who are interesting and have different worldviews to ours are the ones that we're going to be seeking out and kind of indulging those other interests accordingly? Or is there going to be a requirement that anybody who wants to be successful in any area, whether it's traditional publishing or whether it's indie game development, needs to build persona first and think of the work as almost an afterthought, something which you're permitted to create once you've built those networks that support and sustain it. So if you think about Fred Turner writing it from counterculture to cyberculture, he says that in our kind of modern entrepreneurial environment, the expectations of large kind of technologies in particular, but I think we can extend it to anywhere where tech is a component, will be that individuals can no longer count on the support of their employers. They instead have to become constant entrepreneurs, constantly building relationships and opportunities, constantly building those networks to be committed to instantiate that as individual pieces of work at periods and moments in time. I speak to my students and tell them they're likely to have 15, 20, maybe 30 jobs over their lifetime. So what's the consistent element within that? It's the individual, it's the person, it's the characteristics and persona which carries through all of these different environments and all these different situations. There you go, that was mine. There we go. Done. Bit different, I know.
Yeah.
Should I turn it around? I'm not sure if it's turned around or it feels very formal to walk on.
No, it's good because the sound is behind it.
Yeah.
You're sort of broadening of this one? The computer one. So you talk about the sort of the move from sort of attention on the work to the attention on the worker. On the one hand, you can see that as just a sheer increase in the bandwidth. You know, when somebody produces work, it tends to be monolithic and exist in exactly the form that it does. And so people tend to be fairly economical, I guess, with what it is that they're transmitting and what it is that they're expecting to put into the world. The concept of a worker typically seems to be a little bit more holistic in terms of all of the circumstances that surround the production of the work, as well as enabling a sort of attendant sort of media that goes into the sort of the trailers, the making of, that kind of thing. Is that the only way that those things can be broadened, or are there other sort of lenses that people can use to expand what it is that's being sort of transmitted?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways of approaching. One of the things that I was going to talk about a bit was how interesting I found the changing vocabulary from people think of themselves as kind of mediating in a particular form. I'm an artist, I'm a videographer, I'm a writer, or whatever, to content creation. You see, increasingly, initially in kind of more commercial areas, but then moving into even kind of arts communities, talk about yourself as initially used to be kind of things like mixed media, but now thinking about content creation in terms of, you know, anything's artists and, you know, that sort of idea. So I think there's positive ways of thinking about it, which is that you're really trying to cultivate uniqueness. You're trying to cultivate some kind of persona which can be expressed in a variety of different ways, which is interesting in each one of those variations and versions. The negative side of that is that we start to move into a situation where we're relying on that building relationship and with individuals, which I think does privilege certain people who have access to those networks in the first place. And so if we are talking about marginalised voices, they tend to come through small dedicated communities that slowly expand until, you know, they get an article in a left-wing newspaper and suddenly they explode. But without that kind of process, you're very reliant on people who already have those secure networks in place, or are able to tap into them through people whose job is specifically to build those networks and relationships and then to develop it from there, which is where we get into agency structures and that kind of thing as well.
No, cue up after me. We have to do it this way.
A cue on the screen.
Yeah, the cue.
The dream.
The dream indeed. One thing we found doing all kinds of graphs and putting things around is it always comes back to people. I know that that's a flippant, easy thing to say, but it's nice to have you centralize it in this way, because if you have a citation stream, for instance, which is very popular, yes, you look at the ideas, but you also look at the people and where they were and what they were doing. You know, like, why are we physically here today? We could just be reading each other's PDFs, but we don't. So I appreciate that. Over to Scott. By the way, that was Brandon before me for the transcript. So, and this is Scott.
As you move up, I'm just going to add something, which was another thing I was going to talk about, which is the idea of projects, which are historically thought of as kind of trans-individual structures. One of the things I'm really interested in at the moment, I've been reading Clive James's book of essays about 20th century historical figures. One of the things he says at the beginning is that if you look at the whole sweep of all the essays, it's completely incoherent, but individual essays are very coherent. But the coherence comes from the fact that he wrote it over this period of time, and that's what serves that coherence.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of interesting things to think about here. One is the author or the worker as becoming the sort of influencer, which is it's I think problematic for authors that you sort of need to be part of this network and that becomes part of the author function. And then on the other side, a sort of different matter is that when we work in digital media, when we're creating works that are built on digital platforms, of course, the worker is also part of a network of relations, so that the work is a manifestation both of the creative individual who puts them together, but all the other creators that are behind that. And then, of course, one of the exciting, challenging, interesting things is think about what happens when we began authoring with AI as well, and that sort of network of relations. But anyway, those are a couple of things just to bounce off of you. The author's influencer and the author's a network of relations.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that's really interesting. We were talking in the break actually about how Brightgott was talking about, the great thing about the web is that you can do everything you do in normal communities, but you leave your bodies behind. But one of the things you've seen, particularly in the last 10 years, is the great significance of the body, that actually kind of identity and the physical limitations or freedoms that are afforded by the body are a far more significant part of the conversations that are taking place than you'd expect if we were all these kind of neutrals. Obviously, the knock-on effect of that, particularly if you're thinking about authorship and identity and persona, is that if there's a need to manifest a specific aspect of persona in order to rise above the kind of noise, then mundane neutrality or quietness or not having access to, the primary language of your audience becomes a limitation and restriction. So then there's a kind of performance of self, a kind of strategic instrumentality in all your activities and your actions, which I think is when we share the field of authorship.
We're not good at making TikTok videos.
Yeah.
You're not a good author.
The only thing that holds me back is my inability to make good TikToks.
Yes.
One day.
Fabian.
Yes, thank you. So arguably this, we think a lot about VR for video games, but that's also the provocation here for the symposium. This could be the new paddle or the new hammer. And as you started to hint at, it will become through videos a lot more physical, abstracted behind the screen. So yeah, I'm just wondering how work might evolve when we have all those sensors going upward, inward, what people pressure might exert on the workers, especially when those systems, this one, the most popular one, is entirely closed. It's a known ecosystem too closed. So what might be the consequence for workers?
That's actually, it's one of the things I was thinking about with that social penetration theory. It's why I chose that slightly on parasocial relations, which is the obvious touch point for that, is that I think that there's these two tiers of revelation. There's a feeling that people are, you're becoming closer to somebody and you're gaining a more of an understanding. Sometimes that's real and that people are being authentic and, they're expressing themselves. But then there's often the kind of performance of intimacy, a way of suggesting that you're gaining a closer relationship, which you can get through, a closer kinesthetic relationship, or being able to be placed in somebody else's body or somebody else's space. But that performance of self is separate to the actual experience of being that person. And I think often it's more idiosyncratic and often more contradictory when people are being honest about themselves as opposed to the performance of a very coherent, consistent self, which is one of the things that I think social media in particular creates the expectation of, is a consistent, coherent self which can be presented in a variety of different formats but broadly the same way every single time, which I don't think affects reality in the way that individuals in a kind of situational sense actually negotiate and explore relationships and relations.
And just to extend from that,
Hang on, before I just want to introduce, make sure you all know Anne. Anne is there to help us for this. So if you have any questions, and for those who are choosing to go together for dinner tonight, she will make sure we're all in the right place. So, Anne.
to extend what you just said, just a little bit, we've had lots of questions online, which you've actually already answered about the idea of we're limiting the number of people who have a voice because who has access, who can afford access, or where they live. But also, my question, it's not really a formalised question, but the idea of you're playing to your audience's expectation then, aren't you? Because people that create music and create more of the same because that's what their audience buys, and that's what they think their audience is going to keep watching. So if the idea is to be as creative as we want to be, to think big, to dream big, then that's going to be potentially bad.
Yeah, I think those are both really interesting areas, particularly the kind of impact of these increasingly complex. This is one of the things everyone talks about with time, is that the relative simplicity of the tool, but also the cost being free, was what brought people in, not necessarily the attraction of network textuality, but actually the kind of freeness for game development. But then if you have this additional layer, which is the barrier, in the UK it's traditionally been public schools, but now it's this extra requirement of marketing and so on, which obviously does afford advantages as well. I think the other side of it is, I was thinking about Hemingway recently, and that this ignited in my head before I read Hemingway, and this vision created by the kind of mythologizing of Hemingway as a figure, as this kind of huge, robust, terrifying figure of masculinity. And you go back and read the feast, and it's incredibly kind of emotional, and there's a whole extra layer of depth and complexity to it, which if you understand Persona, which is so finely crafted and articulated that, you know, we can all describe anyway, whether or not you've actually read any of his work. And I think that's one of those tricky things, is that the process of persona crafting and management can often be contradictory to the actual work itself, which may seem almost redundant in comparison to the much bigger figure presented on a daily basis in this kind of internet and mediated space.
So on that note, I want to say the thing, and then thank you. The thing is, thank you for reminding us that this new work environment is not about the work product only, it's not about the tools only, it's also about the people, and that means how you relate to them. So thank you very much. And for those of us in the room, it's lunchtime.